inclusion. So with that, we are into our last hour. So we'll get started with our JEDI session for today. Once again, Brenna Sweetman from the NOAA Coastal Office for Coastal Management is our moderator. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brenna to introduce our next speakers to us and then get us started.
Thank you, Mona. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you all on our final day, our final JEDI panel focused on inclusive research and mentoring. So I'm very excited for this final session here. I know that for me personally, my mentors have greatly impacted my worldview and career trajectory. We've got some phenomenal speakers with us here today. So following our usual format, we invite you to ask questions of our speakers. Please go ahead and use the chat. But at this time, we'll start with some opening remarks from each. And it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Tara Cox. Dr. Cox is a professor of marine sciences at Savannah State University, where she runs a summer National Science Foundation research experience for undergrads. This program is focused on introducing early undergraduates to their first research experience. She also currently serves as secretary and co-chair of the ad hoc committee of diversity and inclusion for the Society for Marine Mammalogy. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Tara.
Thank you, Brenna. So if we can all think back to Dion's comment yesterday, I am feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome on this topic. So thank you for introducing my background, but just to give you a little bit of context, I run the research experience for undergraduates program at Savannah State with Chris Hintz. And so I'm gonna say we a lot, but he has not put an endorsement on this, on any of my comments. I also work with on the ad hoc committee for diversity and inclusion for the Society for Marine Mammalogy. And my co-chair there is Eric Archer at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center for NOAA. And again, learned a lot from him and hundreds of collaborators, but, and so I tend to say we, but really these are my thoughts. And so I wanna focus on the term JEDI, and really I do not have much background in the J and the E, and so I'm really gonna focus on diversity and inclusion for my introduction, and pointing out that diversity and inclusion are inextricably linked, but I'm going to consider them individually and try and talk about some of those linkages as we go through. We've heard a lot of in all the panels about diversity and inclusion, and I'm starting from the point that I assume that everybody understands the need. And I think one analogy that I've heard a lot, and we've heard a lot about plants this morning and microbes, and as ecologists, a lot of times we know that diversity is important in ecosystems. And so I argue that it's just as important in academia and in the community. So I'm gonna, again, talk about, I'm very much a practical person, not on the theoretical side. So really, I'm gonna give my top 10 greatest hits. So 5 things I've learned over the past about 12 years in diversity, and then 5 in inclusion, and again, the interaction of those. I also want to give another caveat that I have learned a lot of this through making a lot of mistakes and misstepping. And so hopefully I won't misstep, but I probably will at some point. And so it's hard, it's scary for those of us who especially have been not historically in diverse and inclusive environments. And so don't be afraid to misstep, and I will take any input, thankfully. So I first wanted to point out, when we're talking about diversity, that we've had a hard time defining what we mean by diversity. Dion did a great job of showing us the 11 protected classes. And so when I talk about diversity, especially with our REU and the Society for Marine Mammalogy, we are talking about underrepresented minorities, but also as time has gone on, Chris and I have expanded our definition to first generation students. We've added veterans to our program, non-traditional students, including parents. And more recently, we've entered the space of those with physical disabilities and non-neurotypical students. And so just thinking about all of those things. And then with the Society for Marine Mammalogy, we have a new initiative on LGBTQ scientists. So with that, I think it's really important to define what you mean by diversity and be intentional about focusing on recruiting and, as Makeda mentioned, retention. So the second thing on increasing diversity is rethinking your metrics of success. And actually Jennifer brought this up yesterday about talking about, and again, talking explicitly about academia. So are you evaluating potential master's and PhD applicants on the attributes that you actually value? So a lot of times we fall back on GPA or GRE or test scores. And even as Jennifer brought up yesterday, if they've had a lot of internship experiences and research experiences, and a lot of times those are unpaid. And so you're already narrowing your field. And so if you're thinking about what constitutes success, a lot of times it's grit and determination. And so are you getting at those more difficult to measure metrics of success in how you talk to potential students, how your applications are structured? I also wanted to talk about how you recruit. So a diverse candidate pool does not just immediately arrive at your door. And Nataki actually talked about this 2 days ago on her panel about, don't come in the middle. It takes work. So you have to do the work. You have to build the relationships with faculty with access to some of those diverse students and doing outreach to community groups. I'll give the example, Office of Naval Resources has an HBCU initiative, and we received an email from one of their program directors asking us all to join a webinar the next day at 11 o'clock. Well, a lot of us had classes. We can't just scramble like that. And then I was on a later webinar with him, and he was just like, I was frustrated. I invited all these people and they didn't show up. And it takes more work than a blanket email. And so, and one more on increasing diversity, and this starts to move into that inclusion factor, is be open to teaching different skills than you were used to. So as Dion mentioned yesterday, that underrepresented does not mean under-resourced, but it may mean a difference in thought. So again, focusing on some of the first generation students. I know I grew up with a father who had a PhD, who was very knowledgeable about the collegiate environment. And so there are things that I don't ever remember actually learning. And so it sometimes surprises me when students don't know to just come knock on your door or to utilize office hours, or how to navigate some of that there's a professional advisor to help them. And so communicating constantly, being clear, and being open to what, as a mentor, what your students' needs are. And finally, again, on moving from diversity to inclusion, I encourage all of you to think about inviting diverse scientists to share their science and not necessarily their thoughts on diversity and inclusion. So again, I'm at an HBCU. We have the value of having several African-American faculty members, and they are called constantly to be on diversity and inclusion panels and not invited to talk about their science. And so again, this goes back to, I think, what Jennifer and Dion were talking about, is that, this may be that level of discomfort of having diverse candidate or diverse people on these search committees, if you're asking diverse people to be on search committees, that means that you're pulling them away from their actual jobs. And so asking diverse scientists to share their science allows them to continue on their scientific trajectory. And then it also provides a role model and allows people to be feel more included. And then so to increase inclusivity, therefore to increase retention, hopefully, of that diversity, it seems intuitive, but to increase inclusivity, you have to increase diversity. So it can't just be 1 to 2 people. And again, Jennifer talked yesterday about having cohorts. And so that's something that we strive to do in our REU. It's a new grant that I've just received with Office of Natural Resource or Naval Resources Research, sorry, to create a cohort that can support each other throughout their trajectory. And then one thing that you can also do is try to anticipate hardships that you may have never thought of. So interestingly, I just saw a panel advertised this morning at Oregon State that talks about field-based research and sexual harassment. And so just sitting in on those panels and thinking about what you can do to make places safer. So we had 2 African-American students that we sent to Hatfield Marine Science Center in Oregon State University, and we did not intentionally send 2 of them. 2 advisors, mentors sent them separately. And thank God we sent 2 because they were the only, 2 of the only African-Americans in that small community of Newport, and dealt with some issues that we did not anticipate. And again, this is one of those areas that we may have made mistakes because we weren't prepared for that. So prepare your students be prepared for when you are bringing students into a space that may not be as inclusive, and think about ways to be more inclusive. And reach out to others to find out how to prepare for these situations and have a set of policies and procedures in place. So another example is at some REU workshops we talked about where a PI in a field-based research was the only one who had access to the emergency satellite phone. While this isn't ideal for even for safety, it ended up being a real problem when the PI was accused of sexual assault. And so, so being prepared and having policies and procedures in place for some of those difficult situations. And then wrapping up here, so thinking about students with disabilities, incorporate them early and often in the accommodations that they may need, listening to them and finding out what they need. And we have misstepped a lot on this sometimes, but having a dialogue early and letting them advocate for themselves and giving them a space to feel safe to advocate for themselves is really important. So one example would be that we had a student who was autistic, and we handled it really poorly by just not addressing it up front. And what I would do differently now is I would ask that autistic student to state up front to his cohort what he needed as support, and if he felt comfortable. And so again, just confronting some of these issues, even though they're scary and difficult. So just to wrap up, learning from others, I think it's not just about giving to people, but it's actually listening to people. And one thing that the REUs talk about is being relational, not transactional. So you, as a mentor, you're not just giving something to a student, but you are actually receiving quite a bit of information. And so looking at diversity differently as an inherently good thing, rather than just to check a box on. So I look forward to a discussion and questions and hearing from our other panelists.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cox, for sharing your thoughts on this. Those were a lot of considerations I hadn't thought about before, and wow, that was incredible. Let's go ahead and transition to Dr. Nick Haynen, Hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly there. He is a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Georgia and an adjunct professor in the Department of Anthropology. His research interests include urban political ecology and social movement theory, and a host of related topics. His main research foci relate to the analysis of how social power relations, including class, race, and gender, are inscribed in the transformation of uneven nature and space, and how in turn these processes contribute to interrelated connections between nature, space, and uneven development. He's most recently been working to develop the notion of abolition ecology as a framework to better investigate the independent and interconnected ways race, gender, and class shape the politics of land, property, and social reproduction. He's also currently co-director of UGA's Cornelia Walker Bailey Program on Land and Agriculture, based on Sapelo Island with Maurice Bailey. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Hainan.
Thank you very much. I want to say I'm grateful to be here, and thanks for all the organizing that goes into these things. I know it's a lot of work. I'm going to just pretty much start by telling a story about my experience on Sapelo Island, because it's the only way I can relate to many of these things. And I guess I want to start by saying that a couple years ago, I wrote a short review essay that was titled, "I will always be a white colonial heterosexual man problem in need of radical vulnerability." And the paper was an effort to take seriously my positionality, to understand the intersectionality of my privilege, to reflect on the ways in which white supremacy has shaped and continues to shape most institutions, processes, and patterns of everyday life. And the reason that I start with this is that I wrote the majority of that essay in a trailer on Sapelo in a little community called Pond Circle. It's a trailer that is managed and owned by Dr. Merrill Alber as part of the GCE, Georgia Coastal Ecosystems Long-Term Ecological Research Project. And it's on the campus of UGA's Marine Institute. And it was a very difficult thing for me to write because I was at that moment starting to struggle and process a whole host of things that had happened in the previous years. I had found myself in that trailer because Merrill Alber had invited me to come to Sapelo to explore if there were opportunities to bridge with the saltwater Geechee community in Hog Hammock, recognizing that there had been for a very long time poor relations between the university community and the community. And she and another very important person in my early and constant and still experience, Doug Sampson, who's the reserve manager for the Sapelo Island near site, they had these conversations about, well, we recognize there are these problems, that the JEDI ethos that we're here today to talk about had not been taken seriously historically, that work had to be done, but they didn't necessarily know what that work was. They didn't necessarily know how to approach it. And I had known Merrill through other work. And I think it's interesting to say that I hadn't ever been on Sapelo before. I had barely been to the Georgia coast. So like talking to scholars and practitioners at Sea Grant is kind of a new community for me, which I appreciate the opportunity. But I had been doing work in the Southern Apps, developing essentially a methodology, I guess, that was related to doing long-term community-based listening projects, in which we sought to start with the issues and the concerns and the problems of folks who were residents and citizens of a place, and tried to build research from there, as opposed to imposing our own ideas. And so as I entered into the world that is Sapelo, which continues to amaze me every time I think about it, I think that the mindset that Merrill and Doug had, which I guess I would characterize in kind of a cheesy cliche way, as like a beginner's mind. Like we're going to start as non-experts. We're going to start trying to drop our ego. We're just going to recognize that work needs to be done, and we need to start to build up some traction and relationships, as was just suggested by Tara. Non-transactional kind of relationships, but mutually beneficial foundations from which we can understand and think together. I entered into this world, and it was hard. It's still hard for all kinds of reasons. My first couple of years on island, so this was in 2014, my first couple of years on island, I just very slowly tried to get to know folks in Hog Hammock, in the saltwater Geechee community. And many folks didn't want to talk to me for all kinds of reasons. And I, initially was like, oh, why don't they want to talk to me? What's wrong with me? And it's my own naivete and my own kind of sense of self, I guess, that I had to overcome. And I finally had a meaningful conversation with a descendant in the community named Jasper Watts, who's since become a close colleague and friend. And he said, yeah, I'd be willing to talk to you, but only if you get the approval of a woman named Miss Cornelia Walker Bailey. And so I followed the lead. I said, all right. And I tried to reach out to Miss Cornelia. And over the course of what was longer than a year, it became clear to me that initially that she wouldn't talk to me. She didn't want to talk to me because I was a white person, in part because I was associated with UGA. And it wasn't that she didn't want to talk to me, or that she didn't like white people, or that she didn't like UGA necessarily, although there had been this long bubbling mistrust because folks had worked to damage her community, to dispossess Geechee folks of land. So there was a lot of mistrust. So it was essentially, she told me I had to prove to her that I was worth her time, and that's a whole story in itself. But somehow, eventually, I was able to do that and convince her that I was interested in doing research that was about bridge building, that was about mutual benefit, that was about foundations, that was about trust, at the end of my time with her, we would spend hours at her kitchen table talking about what kind of research could we do. And I think that this is an important moment in my experience here, because I never had any idea what the research was going to be. I just knew that whatever I was going to do was going to help me intellectually grow, personally grow. But I didn't have research questions per se. So we, in the kind of jargon of the research, we co-produced a series of questions. And ultimately, she asked me if I would help reestablish a series of crops that had been grown on Sapelo, and for the purposes of economic development. And so we launched off into this process, and two of her sons, Stanley Walker and Maurice Bailey, were central to this process. The four of us, and it was like this swirl of other stakeholders. Doug was very involved, Merrill was very involved, Fred Hay, the island manager, was very involved. Just a lot of dialogue trying to figure out how do we do this, and how do we do this right, because it required land, it required resources. Sapelo is logistically challenging in all kinds of ways. And so ultimately we came up with a plan, and that's not the point that I'm going to get into here. But the next kind of dramatic thing that happened was Hurricane Irma in 2017, as some of you no doubt remember, September. And much of the Hog Hammock community flooded as a result of storm surge that impacted the island. And much of the nascent agriculture that we had started to grow was destroyed or flooded and kind of ruined. A month following that, Miss Cornelia passed away, so quite surprisingly to me. And we were faced with this like really interesting, and I say interesting, it was tragic and it was sad, but it was like, from the perspective of the conversation of research, interesting moment of like, well, what do we do now? I have built this relationship, this mandate for research came from this person, do I have the wherewithal to proceed? And Maurice and I started to have these conversations at this moment about like, what would she want? How should we proceed? What would my role be? How should UGAMI, UGA's Marine Institute, how should the NEAR, how should these institutions on island respond to these moments? And ultimately we proceeded, and ultimately we established the UGA's Cornelia Walker Bailey Program on Land and Agriculture as a way to build institutional traction, to try and get resources, to try and engage in all these things. And just as a prop, because I'm a prop guy, I have here the one of the first sugarcane stalks from that first flooded field that I always keep next to my office when I'm thinking about these things, to try and keep me grounded and keep me thinking about these issues. One of the takeaways that I think a lot about is just the weight that comes with doing this kind of work when we take our positionality seriously. You know, I think there are a lot of folks that have privilege that I have that haven't yet reckoned with it, and I'm not suggesting that I'm enlightened in any way. It's a constant daily recognition that I have a lot of work to do, but I think it's the willingness to do that work and the awareness of that work is necessary. And I think that, Miss Cornelia had helped me reckon that and internalize that within the research that we were doing. So the spiraling of these things, my biography and my research coming together. Another essay that I just wrote that I think is also, everything is usually based on my experiences here anymore because it's kind of overtaken me, is what Harriet, Tubman, and John Brown can teach us about abolishing white men, which kind of gets at, again, a research ethos of not centering ourselves, thinking about what kind of work we can do in service with others, not in a charitable way, but with others in true sense of solidarity. And I think the notions of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion are all throughout here. But I also think, I guess, one of the takeaways that I want to leave and close with is just that there are very difficult questions around the role of white supremacy on the Georgia coast, or patriarchy, or these kind of elusive power structures that we treat with kid gloves oftentimes when we use the language of justice and equity and diversity and inclusion. Not to say those words aren't super appropriate and very important, but sometimes they make it a little easier than I think that some of the realities of land loss and cultural genocide, as is currently occurring on Sapelo Island, require. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that powerful story. Very thought-provoking, and I'm looking forward to kind of pulling out some threads that you shared there. That was awesome. All right, we are going to move to our third panelist. It's my pleasure to introduce Karina Newsome. Karina is the Community Engagement Manager at Georgia Audubon and recently graduated from Georgia Southern University with a Master of Science in Biology. She began in the field of wildlife conservation as a zookeeper, currently conducts research to conserve the McGillivrays seaside sparrow, and connects people to birds across Georgia. Having experienced the hurdles faced by Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color interested in wildlife conservation, Karina's mission is to center the perspectives and leadership of historically marginalized community in wildlife conservation, environmental education, and exploration of the natural world. And I will pass it over to you, Karina.
Great, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Great thanks to Mona and to all of you for allowing me to be in your company. Compared to the folks who are on this panel, I am very new to the world of conservation, and especially in academia. But similar to what Nick just did, I want to frame this topic around a bit of a story. So I am originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, so not really super coastal, but an urban environment, a low wealth community. And when I came to the coast for graduate school by way of many different cities and states and locales, there are things that I recognize from back home, right? I recognize the impacts of redlining, which was touched on yesterday during the panel, of divestment in communities, right? Even of environmental racism with the placement of toxin producing industries, right? I was aware of that pattern, though not nearly as subjected to it as folks on the coast. So I came to the coast from a position of privilege. So despite the fact that I am from a low wealth background and my family is currently low wealth, currently lives in the same city, in the same location where I grew up, the coast had a different kind of combination of dangers going on. In addition to there being extreme, low wealth relative to other members, particularly in the Glynn County area in Brunswick, you would be on one street and you would have massive mansions and literally go a block, and people had tarps on their roofs because they couldn't repair from the last hurricane, right? Low wealth, you have extreme exposure to issues of climate change, right? In extreme storms, sea level rise, flooding, the issues that come with being in such close proximity to water. You have a massive concentration of polluting industries, like the paper mills and the other mills and refineries. I don't even know what they do. I just know what they smell like and what it does to my throat and to my lungs when I'm out there. I distinctly remember my first field season down in Brunswick, where I was studying the seaside sparrow, going out there looking for nests, living my best life, something that I always wanted to do, studying wildlife. And there's a paper mill across the street from the marsh that I was in. I remember one day the wind blew in the right direction and blew whatever was churning out of this large pipe into the marsh. And I literally was about to vomit. I immediately got sick. And I had to stop doing what I was doing and wait until the winds changed so that I could breathe and keep moving in the marsh. And it was at that moment, I've always been aware, just for survival, right, of the intersectionality of oppression, right? There are many axes of my identity on which I experience exclusion or experience disenfranchisement, whether it's because I'm an African-American person, a woman, a person from low wealth background, person from the city, right? But in that moment, it was a different kind of realization that I had, particularly when it comes to coastal communities, that made me angry, right? That made me angry and almost made me feel guilty for the fact that I was out there looking for birds while people are having to breathe this air, grow up on this air, right? And then I think about the fact, right? So the seaside sparrow, there are multiple different subspecies. One of them is classified as endangered in Florida, called the Cape Sable seaside sparrow. And that subspecies of seaside sparrow, because it is in such a critical position when it comes to its persistence and its survival, a lot of wildlife management happens around this species, right? And because of the prioritization of this species and the fact that the people making decisions about how that species is managed are white folks who are not subjected to the ill effects of bad conservation management, we're making decisions about how to protect that bird, how to manage that bird, that literally eliminated the land that indigenous people are living on near the Everglades, in the Everglades. They were flooding out the land that indigenous people were living on to create space for, I think, like 5 seaside sparrow pairs or something like that, right? And so the combination of the reality of what's going on the coast when it comes to wildlife management, coupled with my personal experience growing up, my background, I'm realizing just how dangerous homogeneity is, right? Just how dangerous it is to have as Nick was saying, the perspectives of white men, middle, upper socioeconomic status, right, as the center pillar for the values when it comes to decision making. And nominally, right, indigenous people were contributing their thoughts to what was going on with wildlife management in the Everglades, right, on paper. But when it came to actually making the decision, their values were not a priority. And that ends up hurting everyone, right, ultimately. And then in many scenarios, even compromises the success of the wildlife management, but that's a whole other conversation. And so when I think about this, I would categorize myself naturally as a systems thinker. So when I think about the whiteness of conservation and the many ways in which that literally compromises the health and livelihood of people like me, Black people, indigenous people, people of color, people from low wealth backgrounds, I'm trying to think about what is the machine that turns out this homogeneity, generation after generation, job cycle after job cycle, right? Like, how does this keep happening? And that's really where my own story comes in. Because I have a particular background, I was confronted with this obstacle course, basically, which I was not prepared to navigate, but that some people are prepared to navigate, right? Like the people who have resources, the people who are at the center of the mainstream story that's being told about natural resources and wildlife conservation and wildlife management. And so as a result, again, like I said, I am fresh into the field of wildlife conservation. But since being here, I've tried to think about the ways, the locations along the pathway, which are completely impassable to people from my background, right? Whether we're talking like Tara was speaking of like, I believe you might have mentioned it and also mentioned yesterday in the panel, like unpaid internships, right? So I started out as a zookeeper, and in that realm of wildlife conservation, you cannot get a job if you don't have 3 years of experience at least, and all experience is unpaid, right? Or if we're talking about the fact that I have never met a wildlife conservation professional, I don't even know what to do to get to, you know, what college, what major, what you know what I mean? I have no context or framework for even understanding what I'm supposed to do. Or if we're talking about the fact that, you know, once I graduate, because I got paid so little in grad school, now I have, or in undergrad and in grad school, I have like accumulation of debt. And now, you know, it is not as easy for me to take a job that's low paying, which many are in the realm of wildlife conservation, right? So there's so many layers, there's so many locations at which there are these gaps in the pathway. And so what I'm realizing is that, and this was also discussed previously, where, you know, oftentimes people want like this quick fix solution, like, okay, let me hire a Black person in this lab, or let me invite an Indigenous person to this, you know, advisory board, or whatever, you know what I mean? Like this kind of appearances, these optics moves, when in fact, you really have to be addressing the system in order to make any sort of change. And of course, every institution, every organization is not equipped in itself to address every gap in the system, every gap in the pathway. And that's why what Nick was speaking about when it comes to relationships is so important. So relationships first and foremost, right? Building trust with the communities that we're working in, right? So while I'm a Black person from a low wealth background, I'm not from Georgia's coast, I'm not from Brunswick. And so there was a level of like invasion that I felt I was doing because I'm not from there, and I'm taking up space in that place, and I don't know anybody, right? But I have some power behind me because I'm with an institution, I'm with a university, and so I can make decisions about what's going on there with no input from the community, and that's not right. I didn't even realize that was going on until after the fact, right? If I could go back, I would change some of the ways that I did my research. But building relationships, building trust, which takes time with the community, not just so that you can kind of weasel your way in, right, and have influence in their community, but so that you can prioritize what they care about. So you can understand, how do they already, like in the case of wildlife, you know, natural resources, wildlife conservation, outdoor access, how do they already interact with their environment? What are the relationships they already have with the world around them, right? Instead of trying to go in and create something new in a place you're not from with people you don't know, offering your resources to be used the ways that they want them to be used, they'll be most effective and helpful for that community, and fitting in the context of what they already do, right? But also kind of inter-organizational collaborations, right? There are some organizations that are really good at getting exposure to the outdoors, right, for kids, right? There are some organizations that are really committed to getting paid internships for pre-professional young people, like Greening Youth Foundation, for example, right? There are some organizations that are really good at getting folks who have already graduated college or graduated grad school, helping them with resumes, and then connecting them with wildlife professionals or conservation professionals, like the Bridge Project, for example. So there are all these, you know, entities that work in these realms at filling the gaps, so to speak. But there needs to be a lot more crosstalk, right, to help actually create a pathway that is replicable, that is usable widely, because otherwise, if the system doesn't get fixed, these kind of band-aids, you know, in over certain issues are only going to be an ineffective and temporary, if at all, a fix. And I also want to encourage you, and I see this happen, and people don't even, I think, realize tokenization. So you can be a perfectly well-intentioned institution, person, lab, or whatever, right? And you might hire or bring in a diverse candidate for some position, right? A Black person, Indigenous person, you know, maybe with a disability, you know, from any sort of demographic that has been historically and presently marginalized. But the point of that is not just to have a brown face on the panel, but it's so that you can actually start to understand the priorities of the community, right? One Black person cannot speak for all Black people. One Indigenous person cannot speak for all Indigenous people. The goal is for you to understand the desires and priorities of the community. And so I encourage people to go into these relationship building efforts and these, you know, justice, diversity, equity, inclusion efforts with that in mind, that the goal is to prioritize the needs of the people who are not currently centered in decision-making and in management, whatever that looks like. So that's what I'll start with. I know we're maybe running short on time, so I'll stop there and leave room for the discussion questions that I know you have, Brenna.
Thank you so much, Karina. Again, another powerful story. Really appreciate you just sharing your experience with passion. Wow. So it looks like we do have a question here in the chat, and it's for Dr. Cox. So since diversity and inclusion are always expected, however, for a specific program or project, including all stakeholders or involved people would make a case to become more complicated or unsolvable because each group of people has different demands and perspectives. How would you end up with a plan or program that can be representative for all stakeholders? Great question.
It's a good question. I think Nick and Karina can also speak to this. I don't feel necessarily qualified perfectly to speak to this. I think a lot of panelists over the past 3 days have talked about it's hard, but you just have to build those relationships. So what Karina was saying is you might not get to that. There is no perfect solution sometimes, but you have to have those conversations first. So while it may seem impossible to bring everybody to the table and please everybody, if you haven't had those conversations, you don't even know if there's an issue. So the seaside sparrow analogy was perfect. The Harris neck that Jennifer talked about yesterday. I mean, we all want wood storks. There's no doubt about that. But at what cost? At the cost of people, reclaiming their land. And, if you haven't even brought those, the Harris Neck Land Trust into the conversation, you won't do that. And I don't have time to go into the story, but look into the story, and it's devastating. And there have been conservation ecologists and wildlife, managers who haven't done the work of having those conversations. But like Nick said, sometimes when you come in, you're not trusted in the first place. And so you have to be humble and you have to listen and be prepared not to be accepted from the first cut, right? And somehow show that you are trustworthy. And there isn't a clear path from today to 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 years down the road, but building those relationships and being genuine and humble in your relationships, I think is the first step. I don't know what all the other steps are, but you need to ask the communities what those steps are.
Thank you so much, Tara. Karina, Nick, do either of you have anything to add from your perspective?
No, I really just echo what Tara mentioned, and I think that one of the dangers, I think we're kind of, our environment structures our minds to think in a way of what's the solution, right? What is the single solution to make everybody happy? And that kind of breeds maybe almost like an unhealthy pattern of solution finding, when you think of it that way, as opposed to the fact that, solution may have to be malleable, it may have to, change, it may have to be very fluid. And I think that not only for the purpose of building relationships and trust and understanding what people value, what their priorities are, when you are getting to know folks, but like people have different perspectives on how solutions are, like what solutions look like how solution crafting, even the process, right? It's like, I realized that I've been doing a lot of unlearning. Like I've had a very rigid understanding of how to problem solve in these very intersectional and very complex issues that center around oppression and disenfranchisement. And so I think, yes, centering, but also elevating, right? Like do not, people oftentimes use the phrase, meet people where you are. And one of my mentors and someone I admire very much, Dr. Carolyn Finney, always says, yes, meet people where you are, but where they are is not less than where you are, right? Where they are is not a lower place. And so understand that you are the least expert person in the room, right? When you go into these communities, they know the most and the best about what those solutions might be. So that's all that I'll add to that.
I might just riff off that just briefly to suggest that I don't think maybe that all stakeholders need equal representation, right? I mean, I think it has to do with the objectives, and I think that Karina's notion of unlearning and the way in which that calibrates what the expectations are in these partnerships becomes a very important aspect. So the malleability, I think I would just echo and hold that up as a real important pillar.
Thank you all. Wow, this is so much good food for thought. You know, it sounds like a common thread is relationship building. You know, really acknowledging that building trust takes time, approaching humbly with a desire to listen. There've been lots of kind of comments over the last few days on this topic. And I guess my question would be, you know, we've kind of talked a lot about these different approaches, but in your mind, has anything bubbled up as kind of a top priority that we can push forward for actionable change on this topic? Just kind of thinking more broadly across our justice, equity, diversity, inclusions. What is kind of, in your mind at this time, the top priority?
Coming from the perspective of, again, I mean, who I am, one of the things that I noticed, and that is one thing that I didn't mention before, but I think is important to think about, and when it comes to engaging, is like the story of whatever your field is. So in my case, wildlife conservation, the story of natural resource management, right? It's like, I don't even know my own people's history of relationship with the outdoors and natural resources, right? I'm recently learning this in the past, like literally 12 months. I'm coming to know what it looked like for African-American people, what our relationship to the land was, how we shaped the land, like what our, you know, what that story looked like. And one of the things that I noticed on the coast is that there is a very pervasive story and a glorification, like almost like a pearl clutching glorification of the oppression of Black and Indigenous people, right? You got plantation museums everywhere. And like, even where I lived for my field research, the Altama Plantation WMA, Wildlife Management Area, literally had the buildings where they kept enslaved people, like where they had them live. And I was gonna have to live there last summer had there not been a pandemic. And it was like, the whole, like the thick and like heavy weight of a narrative they're not a part of makes it very difficult to even want to engage with the strategies and the systems that are in place for whatever your field is. Again, in my case, wildlife management, natural resources management. And one of the things that I've been doing recently and learning about the fact that other people do this too is like having kind of intersectionally educational experiences, right? So sometimes one of the ways to, in my realm, to engage with folks is, connecting folks with the world around them, wildlife, right? But not just doing that, but like incorporating the history of the people who are never mentioned in the geographic space where I'm in. And so giving light and platform to the stories that aren't told, to the context that people are part of, that they don't even know about, that I didn't even know about. Allowing people to see themselves and significantly changing the dominant narrative to reflect truth and to reflect reality, I think is an important part to, and this is a kind of a larger scale thing, but important part to engaging communities whose stories are not currently told, who are currently not represented.
I'd like to add to, I don't know that this is a priority, but I think it's important for people who have not been versed in this to think that it's overwhelming, and that we say do your homework and be humble, but it's not something that you're going to solve or understand in one day and by reading a paper here and there. But it's also not something that is so completely insurmountable. I mean, every day, if you just learn a little bit, and if you have a conversation once a week, I think sometimes we get in our ivory tower and we are scared. And I'll just give one weird, there's a connection in my mind. A friend of mine calls them Tara-isms, but just stick with me. I believe, I can't remember, it was a dean from UGA, came down to Savannah State to talk to us about their new marine science program and bachelor's and how there can be interaction. And there were 2 lessons from that. One was, I said that it should be relational and not transactional, but there are small transactions that I welcome. So he was stunned to find out that the University System of Georgia doesn't have a unified library system, that Savannah State is responsible for our own library. So we don't have access to the wealth of riches that UGA has. So, that's one small thing. He was like, oh, done, we got it. We can give you access. And so there are small things to increase the accessibility of science. But then again, you don't come into that space and think that you can just give us wealth of riches and we have nothing to offer you. And so those are, again, it's not really priorities, but thinking about that, again, it's a relational thing. There are small things that you can do to help increase diversity and inclusion and sometimes equity. But also, again, that humility factor, I think, is really important.
I guess I would just add, like the example of the previous homes of enslaved folks, and I've had some conversations about this at other sites recently that go unrecognized, and these expectations of folks kind of cohabiting them without the engagement with those histories. I mean, there are thousands of stories that are like that, and that when you were just telling that story, Karina, I was thinking, oh my God, how do we unlearn, and how do we kind of think through? Because I think a lot of folks, it's not out of malice, it's out of ignorance, it's out of just not taking the time or not having the toehold, so how do you work toward that? And I think that for me, and for folks that have mentored me, it's that development, as many of us have been talking about, and I heard Lizzie say in the last panel, cultivating that active listening. Some people find that notion of listening or listening whatever to be passive, but I think that that's not true. I mean, it's very hard for me oftentimes it's harder for me to listen, obviously, right? Because then I'm not centering myself and my opinions. And so recognizing the challenge of that and cultivating that, I think, is the way in which we can start to collectively work through some of these structural historical injustices that are with us every day. I think that the other thing that I would say, these are terms that I think are in pretty common parlance right now. And there are lots of different ways of saying that, but I think that struggling through the white fragility and reckoning with white privilege for white folks is a really important part of this. That is also about just not knowing how to get in there. So when Tara says read something every day, there's plenty of resources. And I'm not trying to be preachy. I'm just simply saying this is a way in which progress can be made and collective change can occur. So thank you.
I wanted to add one more thing. Thank you so much for that, Nick, because it made me think about, it's oftentimes we when we think about what do we do, what are the priorities, how do we diversify academia? I think as has been said many times on this panel, relationships are the bedrock of this and trust building. And I think individuals, be it professor, faculty, lab tech, wherever in the field of this conversation you find yourself, get personally. So outside of your job, personally put yourself in relationship with people who are different from you, people who are experiencing levels of exclusion and marginalization that you do not experience. Not in a tokenizing way, in a genuine relationships, right? If there is where you live, in your house, apartment, whatever, if there is an organization in your community that is organizing around a particular threat facing them, go to those meetings, show up, right? Get to know the people around you. And that may not directly translate to whatever you're doing in your lab or whatever you're doing professionally, but it sets you up to be an active listener. It teaches you, number one, how to be an active listener, but it makes you aware of the state of your neighbors, right? And helps you to, wherever you do your work, to be able to think about how to be intersectional in your approach. And so I would just encourage folks in their personal lives, even separate from the work, to do that relationship, genuine, humble relationship building.
Wow. Thank you all so much for your courage to share and talk about some of these really hard topics. For me, this has been incredibly enlightening. You know, there's just a lot to discuss in this space. And, you know, we're coming down to the end. I invite any other folks who are listening in here to ask any final questions. You know, one thing that kind of comes to my mind is, you know, it's, you mentioned unlearning. It's a journey, right? We want the quick fix, how to kind of address these issues immediately, but the reality is it's a process, right? And there's so many layers, as you mentioned, Karina, that kind of make it a complex topic for us all to kind of digest. That said, you know, are there any final takeaways or you know, remarks that you want to share with everyone in terms of how can we move forward, and what are just kind of the small steps that you would encourage people to take as we kind of look ahead to the future here?
I would just argue, be vulnerable. You make mistakes, and that's okay. Just acknowledge them and move on. Don't wallow in them. Don't, you know, just move on. And it's difficult and it's scary, and I tend to run away from scary, but it's necessary if you really care about the environment that you live in and advancing your research in a meaningful way.
Thank you, Tara. Karina, Nick, any final words from either of you?
No, just thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. Make friends, diversify your friend group. That's it.
I love it. Oh, well, thank you again so much. You know, this has been a fantastic panel. I couldn't imagine a better way to kind of wrap up here. So thank you all for joining. Thank you to our attendees. It's been incredibly powerful, inspiring, energizing, and I've really enjoyed serving as your moderator. And so at this time, I will pass it over to Mona.
Thank you, Brenna. Thanks for doing an amazing job on all 3 days. We really, really appreciate it. Moderating is not an easy task, but you kept us all moving forward. So thank you again. Thanks to all our panelists. There couldn't be a better way to conclude the symposium. I feel energized and inspired, and I hope everybody does. So with that, I'm going to read a poem. It's a war poem, and it's one of my, I love war poetry, and it's one of my favorite poems by Wilfred Owen. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we crushed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick, boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or line. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin, If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. With that, thank you all for your time, attention, participation. We'll be in touch with you next week. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.